Good. I just want to thank everybody for joining this conversation today about the Digital Services Act and the EU Voluntary Code on Disinformation. German Marshall Fund has done an incredible job of planning and organizing all the logistics. I'm very grateful to Karen Kornblue and Julia Trehu and all their colleagues. I'm Anya Schiffrin, and I am the Director of the Technology, Media, and Communications Specialization at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. And over the last few years, we've actually had a great collaboration with GMF. We've co-published some reports together, and we've organized, I think this may be our first Zoom. So I'm really happy to be here. The idea was, obviously, Digital Services Act is underway now. I'm sure that the experts on the panel will tell us exactly the timeline for what happens next and when the next votes are. But some people have called the Digital Services Act a game changer in that it's really going to try to implement a new system for platforms to evaluate and assess their own risks from online, mis and disinformation, and then show that they've got a plan to deal with that. This is my understanding. I'm sure the panelists will correct me. And when I started writing about this a couple of years, there was really a lot of excitement in Brussels and around the world, and sort of the hope that what Anu Bradford and others call the Brussels effect, that the laws started in Europe could perhaps have a good influence around the world, especially in the US. So I think there's been a lot of excitement about the Digital Services Act. And then, of course, in July, there was that updating of the EU Voluntary Code on mis and disinformation. And I thought that the end of summer, we all agreed at German Marshall Fund, Karen Kornblue and others, and I thought that end of summer would be a really good time to sort of check in, find out what's actually happened over the summer, what happens, what needs to happen next, and then hopefully we can talk a little bit about the rest of the world and the implications. So we've got a panel of experts here. I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves, and if you want to touch on any of the things I just said, you can, or if you want to kind of launch in with opening thoughts, you are so welcome to do so. But really, I think we were hoping for a sort of update on what's happening with DSA, what are the next steps, how does it interact with the voluntary code? And of course, we'll be taking questions from the audience. Thank you very much. I don't know, Christel, do you want to go first? You're next to me in the Zoom.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Anya, and I've been looking forward to be here today and discuss with you on the DSA and the next steps. And before I go into the topic, I have to say that one of the very soon coming next step is that at 7 o'clock, I'm in Strasbourg, and at 7 o'clock I have to go down in IMCO and vote for a corrigendum on the DSA, so that we will have the last final changes put into the regulation, so it can be publicized in the EU journal, and very soon then start having an impact out there. And I am the rapporteur or the chief negotiator from the European Parliament side on the DSA. So I was the one who was in charge of the Parliament's position and the negotiations. And I have to say that I'm extremely proud of being part of this process, because what I do think we are doing with the DSA is that we're beginning to take back control from the tech giants. Ever since Bill Clinton had an advisor, I think his name was Ira Magaziner, and he said and advised Bill Clinton back at that time to say that, well, the best is not to regulate the tech industry. It's best to leave them alone, because they are not that kind of industry. Ever since that, we've had that, indication on tech industry that they should be left alone and they should not be regulated, and they've been free of responsibility. And the DSA is luckily changing that, not completely 100%, but we're starting. And I'm happy to say that I do believe that we are taking back control. We're putting up some rules, democratic decided rules for the tech industry. And I guess very briefly, Anya, I think that one of the main changes where I really have an idea that this will be a game changer is we're not harmonizing what is illegal. It's still up to the member states and the sector-specific legislation, but we're saying that the very large online platforms, they had to make a yearly impact assessment on a lot of issues, on looking into the systemic risks. That could be disinformation, but it could also be revenge porn or cyber violence or public health. If they find issues, then they have to risk mitigate. And we are not leaving it up to the tech giants themselves to make this impact assessment. We have an independent audit looking into it as well. And we have given, this is new, we've been giving the EU Commission the mandate, the power to enforce the rules, the DSA, for the very large online platforms. And that will mean that we will get an identical enforcement throughout EU, and I do believe that this will have an impact. We are also trying to keep the arm's length principle in place. So we are not deciding exactly when things has to be taken down or when they have to adjust the algorithms, but we are saying that they need to look into it, and we don't want this business model to go on unchanged. So we are also going into that saying that we don't allow targeted ads for minors, and we don't allow using sensitive data for targeted ads. So with these things, there are so many details in it, and it's difficult to do it briefly. But with this, I do believe that it can be a game changer. But, and there is a very big but, it certainly depends on how we are making sure that enforcement will take place. And at the moment, the EU Commission, we're trying to give them money so they are able to hire people who know about algorithms. So we expect that they will have a staff of 70 persons working in this field. And that's a lot. And we have also said that they need to be able to compete on salaries with the tech giants, because otherwise we will end up in the same situation that we saw in the bank sector, that the bank sector took away all the good people from the public authorities. We will not accept this time. So everything comes down to enforcement. The rules are good. They will have an impact if they are enforced in a good manner. And I hope so. And I myself would put a pressure on the Commission to keep on doing that. Thanks.
Thank you. And I just have one follow-up before we go to Benoît. If the platforms decide what are the risks, why couldn't they just happily write reports saying, hey, there are no risks?
Well, for several reasons, and how can I forget to tell this very important topic? Because what we're doing is that we're giving the Commission, as the enforcer, access to the data of the big text algorithms. So they will look over the shoulder and look into the data. And they're not the only one getting access to data. We will also give access for researchers, vetted researchers, and therefore it's not up to the tech giants themselves to decide whether or not things are okay. We will have somebody to look closely into it, and they will have access to the data. And that's why I believe that they cannot say whatever they would like to, or they can, but we have other people to say, to correct it if it's not true. And that is why I do believe that this will have an impact ultimately.
Thank you very much, Christel, and who's an MEP. I think you're in Strasbourg today at meetings. Yeah. Monsieur Loutrel, I'd love to hear your response, your thoughts also about the DSA. I know you're with the French regulator. I assume that you're staffing up. You're very excited. Definitely. I know France was very influential in the formation of this regulation. So looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Well, let me start first. I said it just before, as we gathered before in the waiting room. Mrs. Schaldemose made my day with the text that was released by her committee and that will be voted later tonight. So clearly we are eager to start the next phase, because now that we have the rule book, we have to work on the implementation, which is as important. And this text is really a breakthrough in the design of a new regulatory scheme, which is fit for purpose for digital players, where those platforms are global by nature, but they are local by their impact. whether the impact is intentional or accidental. So clearly we had to design a complete new mechanics and regulatory to protect the capacity of the industry to innovate, because the innovation is at the heart of this industry. At the same time, a framework that would be flexible, as mentioned by Mrs. Schaldemose, to adapt to new challenges, because we clearly see that those digital platforms change on a continuous basis, and the usage are changing also very fast. So we needed to have a text which would be forward-looking, which would have the capacity to adapt to new challenge and not to just deal with the last one we had. And I think we have it with this text, which is really creating a network of regulators, which is extremely important, because we need to have this mix of the EU Commission at the center and the regulators in member states. Both to have the capacity to have a single shop for the platforms. The biggest one will have the single shop at the EU level. Smaller one will have a single shop in each member state with the DSC, respecting the principle of origin, which has been at the heart of the EU construction. And at the same time, because we'll operate as a network with the board of the DSC, working with the EU Commission, we'll have the capacity to have a coherent enforcement at the EU level. So it's really something completely new, and which will need us to build a new culture of working together through this network of regulators. And that's typically what we have started doing at ARCOM, because we have already been mobilized by the French Parliament, which through French laws over the last years to deal with those issues. But now we are trying to prepare to play the same role at the EU level. So we started building relationship with the EU Commission, with the key EU regulators. We still have a keen interest developing a very strong relationship with the Irish regulator, because they are still the country of origin for many platforms which are strategic, and they play a role typically for the vetting of academics, as we will do the same thing in France. So typically there's a new culture to imagine to be relevant both at EU level to deal with global players, but also at local level to make the difference, to empower end users and civil societies. And I will just add with that this feature, the model is really interesting because it's a model which is open, which organizes the empowerment of the civil society, of academics, of end users, which are part of the regulation through the access to data, which is really a key feature in this framework.
Benoît, thank you so much. I mean, it'll be very interesting to see whether this is going to lead to cross-EU collaboration on a whole other range of subjects. It sounds like that's what you're kind of hoping, that this is really going to be a start for that. Do you think so? And which subjects do you think?
Well, I guess that the DSA was also built on the experience of member states. The fact that Germany voted the NetzDG law, the fact that in France, then we had the law against manipulation of information, was really instrumental in building, understanding where were the difficulties to regulate. And we saw that we only had one, the platforms are unique at the end of the day. They are not that much tailor-made to specific countries. It would kill the business model of a digital platform. We would lose a lot if we were destroying such a feature. So clearly we realize we are facing the same issues in different contexts, and we need to consolidate the views of each member state, the issue we are facing, to then get a coherent response and relevant response from the platform at the EU level, because you cannot, one country cannot ask them to go on the right, the other one on the left. So they need to have a clear message that what we needed the EU Commission in the center for the VLOPs. And then we have to work together to check that the enforcement will be there, that the value for citizens is materializing in each country. So clearly, there's this idea that we have to work as a network. I guess the best image we have, the only reference which is close to what we'll be doing through the DSA, is what was done in the banking sector with the creation of a network of banking regulators, with the European Central Bank at the center, but at the same time relying on national central banks and national central banks governors being members of the board of governors of the EU central banks. So you have the same kind of integration to be relevant both at EU level and in each member state.
I think also in academia, we've got sort of a similar problem, which is we don't have a sort of unifying body that can distill, clarify, and set a research agenda. And I know a lot of people are trying to sort of create networks of academics that are working on questions around tech governance, mis and disinformation. And I'm really glad that, Dominique, you got off the subway. You made it on time. Professor Cardon is at SciencesPo. Hopefully you'll introduce yourself, but I know you've been thinking a lot about the kind of data that academics will need. And I also know that ARCOM over the summer had a call to the sort of research community about that. So please, welcome and looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Would you like to unmute Professor Cardon, assuming you're not still on the subway?
So, sorry, I just said that I'm very glad to participate to this conversation. Thanks for the invitation. Of course, I'm not a legal scholar, so I will speak as a sociologist, but also as the principal investigator of the de facto project, which is one of the many hubs that have been created by the EDMO department and the European Digital Media Observatory. So I have a lot of interest in disinformation, which is one of the important subjects. So I discovered the discussion about the DSA, and even if it's quite too complex for me, but very interesting, I think it's a really, how to say that, very clever framework for regulation, because it focuses on process more than on the outcomes, in fact, and it changes the way we frame the regulation of platform. And it's also very important for researchers. So that's more of my part of the question, is that we, as a researcher, for, let's say, for academic reasons, but also for reasons that are part of the fact that we are also citizens, and the issue of disinformation disorders are so important in our political life that we need to contribute and to be part of this regulatory system. And let's say that, in my view, we will have, and I know that it's also an idea coming from Benoît, that there will be, if the implementation and things went well, we also need to have public opinion in this new regulatory framework in this way, just in order to audit the platform. So let's say that for now, to produce some scientific results about the way platform governs data, users, and content, we have many ways to access to data, but they are not very interesting. It's quite complex. It's incomplete. When we produce results coming from data that we scrap, that we gather through APIs, that we use because of many different systems, we produce a result, and then we ask to Facebook, YouTube, and so on, what do you think about the result? And they always explain to us, no, you don't have the complete data set. You don't know how it works, really. You don't understand what our recommender system are. So we need to have a clear discussion with them, with their data, in fact. And that's the thing that is important for me in the new DSA regulatory framework, is the idea that through certain conditions, we could access to data, and in a better way than we used to use data for now. So let me say that we, for example, at the Media Lab, we are part of the partnership called Social Science One, and Social Science One is the kind of portals that have been built by Facebook in order to give access to data for selected research team, but the data are not so interesting. It lasts 3 years to get the data. They have a differential privacy system just in order to protect the privacy of user, which is a very good thing. But with this differential privacy system, it's quite difficult to audit the way that platforms are governing content on their services. So we need to improve that. And there are a lot of things that could be improved. And we hope that with the new DSA, we will have a better understanding of the way they are processing data. For example, let's say that we can access to URLs that have been shared by Facebook users, but only if they have been shared by more than 100 users. And we know that for disinformation, when we try to find and figure out what is happening at the beginning of the birth of a narrative of disinformation, we need to have access to information of smaller information on URL, and we need to access to this kind of data. So there is a contradiction between, and I think that will be part of the enforcement of the DSA will be for researcher and for this kind of question will be the articulation between two principles. One is the idea that we need to have an external audit of the platform coming from NGO, from researcher, and from regulatory bodies, and the GDPR with the privacy principle, because we perhaps have to imagine a way to access to data without making them public in a certain way, to preserve the anonymity of the data. And let me say, just to finish that, it's also a good situation, I hope, for the French case, and I'm sure that it will happen with the ARCOM, that we try to build a kind of coalition between researcher, and researcher need to be, to have their academic freedom and independence, of course, and they have to produce many kind of results that are scientific results that are not devoted to the audit of platform. But we need to have a kind of alliance coalition with the regulatory body, and it's at the national level, but also at the European level with EDMO, just in order to produce those kind of network and to have a leverage that is efficient on platform to get the data that we need.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think we're always hearing that about data transparency and the need for it and the difficulties of researcher, and it sounds like you've thought about this very deeply and have lots of constructive suggestions, which I'm sure you're putting forward. Mathias, you're going to correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess it would be safe to say that you work for a nonprofit consultancy that works on a lot of these subjects. And I know that data is part of what you're looking at, but I'd love to hear more about your thoughts as a sort of representative of the kind of non-governmental world. And I'm very pleased with the balance of this panel, because we've really got everything. We've got sort of national regulator, EU, academia, which of course is incredibly important, and the NGO world. I also want to say that our audience is extremely impressive. I've been looking at the names of the participants, and it's a very high level audience. So I'd like to make sure that you're fully engaged in this discussion. And I have a bunch of questions, but I don't want to monopolize. So please start putting questions in the chat, and we'll get to you as soon as we hear from Mathias. Thank you so much for being here, Mathias.
Thanks, Anya, and thanks for inviting me together with all these brilliant experts to talk about the DSA as well. Not only the DSA, but also a code of practice on disinformation, and then potentially global implications, right? So quite a large topic. And it does seem like we've sort of cooked this up in advance, but I was very pleased to hear like all three speakers really single out and highlight the access to data provisions in the Digital Services Act as one of sort of like the key innovations and key breakthroughs, I would say, in terms of improving platform governance in the world. And I think it's a very important topic, not only for the DSA, but also code of practice on disinformation, where it features, and also as a potential element that could be taken over by different jurisdictions all over the world and can be implemented domestically as well. Because I think sort of you can't really copy paste the DSA in many other different jurisdictions, because obviously this is being negotiated and developed in the context of our specific EU legal system, but you can identify a couple of really key articles there with some sort of adaptation you could see being adapted in sort of South Korea, in the United States, for instance, as well. And I just because it's so crucial as well, and also because it's one of my hobby horses, I just wanted to indeed sort of like really sort of highlight like what actually is going to be possible now under the DSA, and what are further steps that are needed to implement these sort of, especially these access to data provisions. And I think it's interesting to sort of compare how access to data is being sort of regulated in the DSA as opposed to the code of practice on disinformation, right? So in the DSA, we have Article 31, which is actually going to force so-called very large online platforms to hand over data to a researcher at the request of a regulator. And what's important here to realize, I think, is that researchers can be both considered as pathfinders and as quasi-auditors in the DSA regime. And so they are pathfinders because through this access to data regime, researchers will be able to spot new and emerging risks that may have not been covered by these companies' risk assessments as well. And sort of this is also sort of a response to what you were earlier asking as well, Anya, as well. Just sort of for those who don't know the DSA by heart right now, in Article 26 in the DSA, very large online platforms, they need to sort of identify, analyze, and assess any systemic risk related to like the design, the functioning, or use of their services. And when we talk about disinformation, this could go, for instance, this is about assessing risks, or like to what extent are bad actors using a specific platform to spread disinformation, like Russian government agencies deliberately posting disinformation, for instance, or on the other side, like to what extent do companies' design choices exacerbate those risks? Like, for instance, to what extent does YouTube amplify or recommend COVID-19 misinformation? So companies, they will have to assess these risks, but through the access to data provision, sort of academics will be able to sort of see to what extent the homework that these companies were supposed to be doing is actually sufficient, and whether they had missed any sort of emerging risks actually. And then I think at the same time, there are also quasi-auditors, because they can also assess whether self-regulatory initiatives to mitigate some of these risks have been effective in practice. And for instance, just a hypothetical example again, if YouTube says right now, we have seen that Iranian actors, for instance, have been trying to game our recommendation algorithm, which would be sort of seen as a systemic risk under the DSA, we took actions X, Y, Z to mitigate these risks. I mean, the current situation is like we have absolutely no way whatsoever to assess to what extent what YouTube is saying is correct actually. Like, have their interventions be effective or not at all? And like actual researchers will now be able to also assess whether those interventions to counter disinformation were effective. And I think this is extremely important also because something what Benoît was referring to, because this basically establishes this third layer of scrutiny, like apart from scrutiny from the auditors and apart from scrutiny of the regulators. You have scrutiny from scholars in their respective field actually. And so in the DSA framework, it requires companies to share data reactively in response to a request from a regulator. However, if you look now at the code of practice on disinformation, a number of companies, and there's like Google search, YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, Microsoft Bing, LinkedIn, Meta, and Instagram, they have all committed to proactively share data with researchers through the EU code of practice as well. And I think here, like the goal of data sharing is slightly different compared to the DSA, because under the code of practice, access can be granted for any research purpose on quote unquote disinformation, which is defined in the EU Code of Practice on disinformation, but not in the DSA for very good reasons, I think. And it is not limited, like that research or those research questions won't be limited to assessing platforms' roles as they address risks or take appropriate risk mitigating measures in the DSA actually. And so I think though that's a very interesting sort of constellation, and it really establishes like a completely different foundation and starting point that changes the incentives for companies quite dramatically to share data with others. And then finally, I think if there is indeed like one topic that really leans itself well to be exported, if you want to call it like that, to other jurisdictions, then it's exactly those access to data provisions, right? For instance, in the US, it is sort of a relatively bipartisan topic where both sort of Republicans and Democrats can see the value of and could agree on potentially one form of legislation. I think sort of it is accepted, I think, by a wide range of regulators that it's really essential to gain more information about the potential harmful or even positive effects of the use of a service in a specific jurisdiction. And I think, for instance, it was not a surprise that access to data was one of the topics that the EU and US have been discussing with each other in the context of the Tech and Trade Council as well, actually. And indeed, sort of like Dominique has highlighted as well, there are very serious privacy considerations as well, which I think at least in Europe, we have made good progress. And I'm a little bit biased because I've worked on this as well. In the context, the ADMO working group on platform to data access for researchers have published like quite an extensive sort of report, basically going through all the GDPR related obstacles in sort of that platforms can face when sharing data with researchers and how to overcome these as well. And I'm suspecting that some of these difficult questions will also be sort of solved in the next 12 to 18 months in the EU's upcoming Delegated Act on, which is a secondary piece of legislation on access to data, actually. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Matthias, thank you so much. I'm looking at the questions that are coming in, and you've anticipated some of them. I'm trying to sort of group them. We've got a whole lot of questions about access to data, including from Senator Simon's office, from Ellen Goodman, from Daphne Keller. Actually, she has more questions of open questions. So what I'm going to try to do is, the questions are coming fast and furious. So I am going to try to group the questions into data and then maybe enforcement and auditing, because I feel like those are sort of the three. So here we go. Let me try to distill. I always tell my students distillation is a really important skill. Hopefully I won't mess it up. And if I do, folks, feel free to remind me in the chat. So Ellen Goodman is pointing out that the centerpiece of DSA is access to data and audits, but there isn't actually a lot of specificity about what data is expected to be released, nor what audit standards will apply. Can any of you, and I give us an overview of what data vetted researchers and government will have access to, how it needs to be standardized or deal with cross-platform distribution, and how audits can be effective without consensus on audit standards. There were a couple of auditing questions. Another point from Paul and Minhas in Senator Simon's office: YouTube has a history of external and internal opacity, often denying information access to content creators. Does the DSA provide for greater internal transparency requirement for the internet's monopoly video streamer? I'm curious about TikTok, by the way. Okay, so those are some of the data questions. We've also got a whole lot of stuff on enforcement. I'm just looking to see if there's any other data questions we need to answer. How can these provisions to access be abused by state actors and jurisdictions that do not have railguards to protect against stifling freedom of speech? Jacobo from Witness is asking about that. And that, of course, gets us into this whole question of, should DSA be emulated? But maybe these first questions, And perhaps it's related also to Daphne Keller's question about what are the most interesting open DSA questions that will be resolved or come close to resolution like 6-12 months. I won't read any more questions because then nobody will be able to remember what the questions were. So that's my starting roundup on the data questions. Thank you. I don't know who wants to begin. Thank you, Benoît. Go for it.
I guess it's extremely important that in the DSA, you don't see an exact definition of which data is going to be released. We've learned that typically with the national laws that were voted, where we experimented, and we discovered that, of course, you have to adapt yourself. Its list of data will change on a continuous basis. So it was more important to have the governance in the DSA of how to design those access and see how the regulators, that's why you need regulators, you need this network of regulators, will specify which data need to be accessed. But what we needed, on the contrary, was really the governance. And this is what you can read and find in the DSA. So it tells us that the DSA will have will have the capacity to adapt to new circumstances, to new challenges, and will change over time. Another aspect is that on day one, you won't have everything. On day one, academics will be deceived because on day one, you cannot build all the access. That's part of the issue, and that's one of the challenge in the implementation. We need an implementation plan. We need to build now a strategy on how do we kickstart the system. What are the key elements which are strategic on the year one, and what are the issue maybe which will be more complex that will be pushed to the year two, because DSA is here to stay for a long time, and we have to build over time the capacity on first get low-hanging fruits, and then develop the capacity, develop a common understanding between regulators and academics, and between regulators, academics on the platforms. To have a successful implementation. And over time, I'm sure that we will see on-the-shelf data accessible, which have been anonymized through APIs, things which will be more sophisticated. We need to have vetted academics, because maybe it's more touchy from a GDPR point of view. The GDPR authorities will insist that it has only to be accessed by academics which have demonstrated the capacity to deal with very sensitive data. And I'm sure that at some point we'll have periodical call for interest to ask academics what are the very sophisticated data they want to access, typically on a cross-platform basis, which is something which will be extremely interesting, but also extremely complex. And maybe we won't do it on year one because it's too complex. That's what I can say.
Yeah, I love Henri Verdier's comment that I quoted last year, that the early anti-money laundering laws were don't bring a suitcase of dollars to the bank. And then they got more complicated, then they developed. So I think you're all assuming that that will happen here. I think Christel had her hand, and then Dominique, please. Thank you.
Yes, I had, and thank you very much. A very good question. And I do understand that you are very curious about how this will work in practice. What kind of data will you get access to, how fast, who will have the access to the data, and things like that. So let me comment on a couple of these questions. First and foremost, for the very large online platforms, it is the EU Commission, and besides that, only, of course, researchers that will be vetted, but member states that will get access to data is only the member state in which the company is situated. So it depends on where it's established in EU for member states side. On audits, we have said that the audits needs to be independent, but then so it's up to the platforms to choose an independent audit. But remember, they need really to be independent, and the Commission will look at the audits and also react and raise questions. So I guess we will have to work over the next month, find out how the system will work, and how it will. If we have done it in a good manner, in correct manner, or if we have to find our ways to put a political pressure on the Commission to do more. So I also saw that somebody asked about the working group in the European Parliament. tonight, even besides the fact that we have to vote on this corrigendum, we will also have a meeting where we will hopefully decide to establish 2 working groups, one on the DMA and one on the DSA, where I hope that on the DSA that I will be the Parliament's responsible, since I was the chief negotiator, to follow up, to follow the Commission when they implement the DSA, and also in the coming years to follow up what will happen on the DSA, because even though we made a good legislation, there's still a lot of questions we need to tackle. But basically, we will open up on the data, but not everyone will get access. So, for instance, Hungary will not get access to Facebook's data because Facebook or Meta is not placed in Hungary. So in that way, there is this division of work, and I think that's important, and that's why we gave the Commission the enforcement role, because then it will cover the whole of the EU, and we hope that they will look into making sure that things are balanced. Code of conduct, code of practice on disinformation will be a part of this. The GDPR learnings, etc. So we have a lot of questions. We hope that we will be able to deliver on it. And Anya, you met also Margrethe Vestager yesterday. I don't know if you had a conversation about this as well, but I know that Margrethe Vestager is very keen on starting to implement, to enforce the DSA, and I guess that's a very big help. So soon we will know more, but we also need to give ourselves the needed time. There is a reason why we have 6 months of application before the DSA will be applicable, because it takes some time to find all the solutions. Thanks.
Christel, one follow-up. One of the questions was about how the auditors will remain independent, and are the platforms paying for their services? I imagine that this came up in your discussion. What were the differences? Yeah, what did people think when that came up?
Well, I mean, it is like when you're auditing the money of a company, the use of money, the accounts. So, will an audit company be able to stay independent? Yes, I do believe they will be. But of course, we will follow up on this as well, because we need to make sure that the audits are real independent and really can look through what the company is saying, so that we know that they will stay critical. Otherwise, they will not be able to do their work. And maybe we will have to look into whether they have to be changed every 2 years or 3 years or whatever, to make sure that they're not getting too close to the company. That might be some of the things we can follow up on. We have a lot of experiences in these things in the EU, so I guess that we can be inspired from other areas. I hope, at least. We really need to make sure that they are not getting too close to the companies.
Yeah, I mean, including, I'm just remembering back the 97 financial crisis, how the rating agencies were really discredited, and of course many of the auditors. I see that both Dominique and Mathias want to speak, so wow, yeah, we have a lot of great questions. Go ahead, Dominique.
Perhaps,
and then Mathias.
Briefly about the access to data and the question about that, and just to say that, as Benoît said, it won't be easy. Right? It will take time, and we need to learn by doing and in this process. So let me just take a few examples. For example, we don't have that as researcher. A good database of disinformation. We have a good database at EDMO of fact checkers, but fact checkers are not disinformation. On Facebook, with their flagging system, they have information about URLs that have been signaled as problematic. So we need to produce those kind of database, and it's quite a common work. Another example, we say that we need to edit the way the content moderation policy of the platform. So in fact, we need a database of the content that have been banned by the platform. But if they ban a content, they shouldn't have a database of those content. And for research, if we want to edit the kind of things that they did, when they decide that it should be banned of their platform, we need to access information. So it's quite a problem. So we have the very good report coming from the working group of EDMO conducted by Rebecca Trumbull. It's very important, but there are many cases and situations in which we don't have the solution for now. We need to invent this kind of solution. And let's say just because Daphne Keller is here and it's one of her ID, there is also something in the way researcher will try to work with this kind of data is the fact that we change the kind of regulatory system in the industrial age of algorithmic moderation. We are speaking, in fact, about a statistical and a probabilistic regulation. So if we want to produce some good research and audit of the way platforms are working, we need to have the competency, the large amount of data in order to produce statistics on the way they are regulating content. And it will demand for researchers, for the European Commission, for all the external bodies that are not tech companies to improve their competencies and their capacity to analyze this kind of data. So we have a lot of things to improve in order to be in situation to produce the kind of supervision that is needed for now.
Great, Matthias.
Just very quickly, sort of first, I completely agree with Benoît's point that it would have been foolish or not even productive actually to really define like all the sort of data points that both sort of regulators and academics should have access to, because you should be allowing from some sort of exploratory research for both academics and auditors as well. So sort of the phrase that is being used, that sort of regulators should have access to every type of data that is necessary to assess the compliance of a company with the DSA's obligations. And for academics, like I do think we will, we are sort of at the start of a very long 12 to 18 months process, really trying to figure out how this is all going to work in practice actually. And I just want to sort of stress as well, and maybe do some expectation management to a certain extent, because we're not only adopting the DSA like a landmark piece of regulation, but we're also creating almost from scratch in some countries a complete new sort of regulatory oversight mechanism as well, right? So I think what the DSA does very well in terms of overcoming some of the problems that we've seen in terms of GDPR enforcement is making sure that indeed sort of European Commission can sort of proactively investigate specific complaints as well, especially when it comes to the role of very large online platforms. But we'll have to see how on national level this is all going to be enforced. Sort of even with GDPR enforcement, which has been pretty difficult, at least in some of the member states, there was sort of 20 or 30 years of experience of national data protection regulators. And now sort of we're throwing all these new responsibilities and oversight tasks to sort of a media regulator or competition agency or a telecom regulator as well, depending on what a national member state will choose. And it's going to be pretty challenging to have like all these different animals, so to say, like to develop a common language for all these different enforcement authorities who come sometimes from very different backgrounds as well, actually. So yeah, like what I'm personally also very interested in is sort of knowing what the sort of evidentiary requirements and thresholds are going to be for European Commission to launch a proceeding or an investigation into into sort of some of the activities of the very large online platforms. And then finally, indeed, on sort of the auditing question as well, I do think here as well, like we are basically talking about the creation of a whole new field to a certain extent, right? Because if you really read carefully some of the limitations as to who can actually audit some of these very large online platforms, then it's not very straightforward that some of the usual suspects in this field, like the PricewaterhouseCoopers of this world, could actually take up that role, actually, especially if they have been performing services for some of the companies earlier as well. So here again, we're talking about training people in universities and really create a pipeline of good people that can take on these roles as auditors, as academic researchers, or as staff of independent regulators, actually.
Apparently, we have lost our moderator.
Oh, yeah.
So
It's time to self-regulate this panel then, Benoît.
Okay.
Anya is back.
It's amazing. I'm in a hotel with lousy Wi-Fi, and I even got like a huge cable, so this wouldn't happen. Obviously, you'll be fine without me if it happens again. What I was going to say is, Benoît, when you answer, because I saw you had your hand up, there were a couple of other questions. One was from Canada asking whether the actual categories were wrong, because the 45 million users doesn't treat too many different platforms in the same way. Should that have been rethought? And then another question was also about building a regulator. What's the expertise? What's the structure? What are the values that are necessary? So those two, and then we've only got 4 more minutes. So if I get cut off again, I think there's so many questions about the role of NGOs, civil society, academia, and journalists. So I bet Mathias or Dominique will take some of those. Okay.
I raised my hand on the last element you mentioned, the role of the civil society and NGOs, because I really think it's critical. So I give my cent on it.
But we need you on the regulator stuff because you're a regulator. So don't.
I'm a regulator, but typically I know that initially we started thinking, okay, how do you design a regulator to deal with all those issues? And you start building, saying, oh, you need more people, more expertise. And at some point we realized that if we were going that route, we would end up speaking Chinese or Russian, if you see what I mean. So we realized the only way to design a regulatory framework and regulators that would be consistent with democratic values was to consider regulators as catalysts to empower the civil society. Because let's not forget, at the end of the day, yes, we have the platforms, but we are also the good citizens who are using the platform and a couple of bad guys. And we have to deal with, part of the issue is how do you convince platform to be more accountable. Part of the issue will be also to change the way we use it. And that's why there is no alternative as to mobilize the civil society and really empower the civil society. And when we give access to academics, I'm convinced that at the end of the day, it will then move to the NGOs who will build on what have been discovered, the knowledge that will be created by the academics, and they will be empowered and they will have the capacity to participate in the policy debate publicly with the parliaments, EU Parliament, national parliaments, to have a political dialogue with this platform to get them to change the way they operate, to get them to change the design of the platform. So what skills do we need as regulators? Honestly, at this point, we realize that we need new skills, which are community management people, because in a way, I started the discussion 1 year ago with Dominique. I'm so pleased you invited him. And I told him, we want to work with you. And Dominique told me, but I don't want to work for the regulator. And because his assumption was that I was asking him to work for the regulator, and I was telling him, no, there's a new paradigm in DSA coming in. It's we, the regulator, are going to work for you. That's typically why we need new skills, because we'll have to add as a catalyst to help understand what are the difficulties being faced by the academics, what are the difficulties being faced by NGOs, what information is coming from the society, and organize these flows of information. The issue will be discovered locally by the civil society, by NGOs. We will try to make sure it flows up to the Commission and that are being heard. The difficulty faced by the academics, same thing. So it's really why we need this network. Again, platforms are global, the Commission will be at the center, and we need them. But we also need to be sure that it will work in each member state. So we need regulators will play a new role. And I think it took me a long time to understand, but they will act as coordinators. So again, even the language is the right one in the DSA.
Thank you very much. I just can't believe that we're actually out of time and Christel Schaldemose has gone to vote. What I'm going to try, so thank you so much for being here to everybody. A lot of great questions. I think that what we're going to try to do, Julia Trehu from GMF will try to go through the transcript and hopefully like write up a summary, because I know with Zoom so much information goes by and it's hard to kind of grasp all of it. So do keep on the lookout and obviously email me at Columbia in a couple of weeks once we've written sort of the high points for everybody. I want to thank all the panelists. We've been planning this all summer. It's great it finally happened, and this really expert audience for all the good questions. So, and for everyone who helped organize, Laurent Nicole, Karen Kornblue, Julia Trehu. Thank you so much to all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.